Typically, the police misconduct is either studied at either the officer level or the department level. So people have looked at what characteristics of departments lead to more misconduct, or what characteristics of individuals looked at predict more misconduct. But what we tried to do, we tried to look at something in between. So the interactions between officers in a police department. And a lot of us are criminologists, and we study crime and co-offending. And the idea here is that we don't think there's anything different in terms of deviant within an organization, whether it's in a police organization or whether it's in a street gang or with other youth delinquents. And there's a lot of theories in criminology that shows that peer influences will dictate whether someone will engage in crime or if they will continue to engage in crime. And so basically we took this framework and we tried to apply it in the context of a police department, because the deviance is deviance regardless of if you're looking at peer delinquency or if you're trying to look at delinquency within a police department, for example. So we thought this is one of the first studies that looks at the social networks of officers, and we thought that maybe this would be a better approach than just looking at the high level kind of culture of a department and just the individual, and try to see if maybe there are opportunities for intervention as well. We wanted to look if peers in police department would influence their colleagues in future misconduct. So if you're associated with someone who has a history of police misconduct, does it lead you to, in the future, yourself be involved in that type of behavior? So we looked at data from 2007 to 2015 that was collected by the Invisible Institute. And basically what we tried to look at is when someone is involved in a use of force complaint, or when someone is involved in a complaint, they have a history of being named with other people in a complaint. And what we're trying to do is, if you're stopped with someone, if you're named on a complaint with other people that have a history of use of force, is your next misconduct complaint likely to be use of force complaint as well? And so we do that by recreating basically the social networks of the officers based on who they're named with on these misconduct complaints, their history of misconduct, basically. Basically, for each complaint, there might be multiple people named in that complaint. And so what we do is we take the history of all the complaints that the officers had, and we looked at who they were named in those complaints. And so this is kind of a proxy for their social network, in the sense that we know who they have had an interaction with, at least in terms of these problematic behavior. And it's a limitation of our study that we couldn't look at the broader social network. But it's one of the first studies to look at, and we're hoping that we can better that measure of the social network. But it's essentially how we measure the networks of these officers based on their being named on complaints with other officers in previous years. The bad apples could be the three officers that were themselves named in the prior use of force complaint that then influences this new officers. It could be a rookie, it could be someone who just had no prior involvement, to be involved in the future in use of force complaint himself. So basically it's the process of the bad apples rotting the barrel, essentially, and that we're trying to look at. And what we find is that, especially these individuals, that if we replace people in the field with other individuals that have no history of use of force complaint, these people in the future have higher likelihood of they themselves being involved in use of force. So we're basically studying the process of the bad apples rotting the barrel. Essentially, if you're connected to a large proportion of individuals that are bad apples, your chances in the future that your next misconduct complaint will be a use of force complaint increases by about 26% if someone has a 40% proportion of bad apples in their network, basically. I think we weren't very surprised based on the theory in other settings. I think there's some positive of that findings is that we know that if we replace people in the field too quickly without addressing the behaviors, then we're putting at risk other people, presumably other younger officers that are coming in, or people that don't have a history of misconduct at themselves kind of developing these behavior, which is the same process. We don't want to replace officers into in the field too quickly if these behaviors are not addressed, because it's not just that this person might later on be involved in more of these problematic behavior, but it's also that it might affect other officers themselves. So it's not just the officer that we're replacing back in the field that can cause more problems, but it's also the officers that are interacting with that officer that's being problematic.